Hello, and welcome to part one of my Road to the Constitution video number 3 for this unit. During this video, you will be able to explain the relationship between key provisions of the Articles of Confederation and the debate over granting the federal government greater power. So just some context for you as far as the origins of the Constitution. This will probably be a review for you from U.S. history. But let's go back to the French and Indian War for a moment, 1756 to 1773. This is when the British and the colonists were fighting the French and the Native Americans for more territory in North America. So if you look at this map, this was the British territory in the pink. This was the French territory in the blue. The outcome of this war is that the British win, more than doubling their territory. But another result of this war is that they went into great debt as a result of it. And so they begin to tax the colonists more heavily. And this leads to unpopular taxes in the colonies, like the Stamp Act. So the significance of this war is that it changes the relationship between the colonists and the British and starts to set the stage for the Revolution and documents like this one, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, right? So Thomas Paine wrote this in January 1776. It's a pamphlet advocating independence from Great Britain to the people of the 13 colonies. It was written in a very clear and concise way. It became an immediate sensation and was published throughout the 13 colonies. This document, written in January 1776, later inspires the Declaration of Independence, written in July of 1776. The Declaration of Independence was written by multiple people, but most notably Thomas Jefferson gets the credit for it, right? So in the Declaration of Independence, we see a list of grievances against the King of Great Britain, King George, talking about why the colonists wanted to break away from Great Britain. Both of these documents were greatly influenced by John Locke, who we've discussed before, and his second treatise of civil government, where he advocates that government should protect our natural rights. And to John Locke, natural rights were life, liberty, and property. He also advocates for limited government, restrictions on what the government could do, right? That the government should post laws so they can't change them arbitrarily, that the government can't take property without consent or violate people's natural rights. And all of this comes down to the idea, again, of popular sovereignty, that the government gets its power from the consent of the governed. All three of these documents help to set the stage or lay the base for our Constitution. However, before we get our Constitution, in the first 10 years post-Revolutionary War, the United States is operating under the Articles of Confederation, our first governing document of America. It was written in 1777, but wasn't ratified until 1781, and it establishes a quote-unquote firm league of friendship between the states, right? Each state at this time was operating almost as its own nation. So the Articles of Confederation stresses the sovereignty and independence of the states and greatly limited the national government. And again, this is a response to Great Britain and the fear of a strong national government or a monarch taking the people's rights away. We see a lot of issues during this time within the document, so internal issues, problems with the Articles of Confederation. You can look here in this column and see the weaknesses, and I might get these down in your notes, these weaknesses. You can pause me to do that, and then you can read for yourself the outcome as well. So a major weakness of the Articles of Confederation is that the federal government or the national government has very, very little power, right? No power to tax, no power to enforce laws, no power to regulate trade, right? It was really hard to change the Articles of Confederation. It was almost impossible. It was really hard to enact laws. And again, the Articles of Confederation only had one branch of government, the legislative branch. It did not have an executive or a president, and there was no judiciary or national court. The Articles of Confederation did do a couple of things that were positive. One, under the Articles of Confederation, we get the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787, which gave the United States a process for adding new land to the Union and barred slavery in Northwest territories. And we also see the government under the Articles of Confederation negotiate the end of the Revolutionary War, right, with the Treaty of Paris. But for the most part, the Articles of Confederation failed. Some external examples that we see of this is that after the Revolutionary War, there was an economic crisis, okay, for a variety of reasons. Because the states had so much autonomy, they had different currencies. There were trade disputes, and there was a lot of war debt. Our government had $70 to $80 million in debt, owed both to Spain and France, who were our allies during the Revolutionary War, and also to soldiers who had fought in the Revolutionary War, who the government had essentially paid with IOUs. Also at this time, if we're talking about economic turmoil, we see our economy tank because there was a reduced demand for goods, right? There was no longer a need for the purchase of food or war materials that we see during wartime. Also, tens of thousands of slaves liberated themselves in the South, and white Southerners really viewed this as a destruction of their wealth, and so the South was in great economic turmoil as well. Another external issue that we see during this time is Shays' Rebellion. So Shays' Rebellion occurred in the late 1780s, led by Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War veteran. And this is really a rebellion against foreclosures on farms. And these disgruntled soldiers and farmers attacked courthouses. And the reason they attacked courthouses was so that the court could not rule in favor of the banks regarding the foreclosures. Why is this significant? Well, Shays' Rebellion is an example of how weak the Articles of Confederation were. There was no national military, right? Each state had its own militia. And so the Shays' Rebellion helped people realize that the national government just wasn't working. It couldn't even protect its people from small rebellions like Shays' Rebellion. So we see a slow march towards change, which starts with the Annapolis meeting in 1786. This was an attempt to discuss changes to the Articles of Confederation, but was attended by only 5 states, right? At this meeting, though, Alexander Hamilton gives some impassioned speeches as to why things need to change, and the delegates agree to meet the following year in Philadelphia. Well, during this time, then we have Shays' Rebellion, and it becomes really apparent to people that that change is necessary. And so at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, we see that almost every state shows up. 12 of the 13 states show up, every state except for Rhode Island. You don't need to necessarily write this down, but just to give you an idea of who was there, right? 55 men, mostly, again, wealthy, educated, people who were from larger urban areas, not necessarily rural areas. And if we're talking about like the key players who you'll hear about here, we're of course talking about James Madison, who is seen as the father of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, who was an advocate for a strong central government. George Washington, who we all know as our first president, was the successful leader of the Continental Army. And then finally, Benjamin Franklin, who was the oldest delegate at the conference. Some key people that weren't there, for example, Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were both diplomats in Paris, so they were not at the Constitutional Convention. John Adams was a diplomat in England, not there. Also, Patrick Henry, who was a staunch anti-federalist, refused to go because he, quote, smelt a rat, right? So before I move on, I just want to say that the delegates came to Philadelphia originally under the guise of just altering the Articles of Confederation, not necessarily form an entirely new constitution, right? They originally thought they were just going to revise the articles, but it soon became clear that they needed to start from scratch. They deliberated in secret, really, with the windows and doors of the building closed to prevent leaks. And you should just keep in mind, as far as their environment is concerned, that this proceeded through the summer months. And so we have the windows and doors closed. We have all of these guys wearing woolen vests in a building with no ventilation, obviously no air conditioning, no indoor plumbing. And so it was a very uncomfortable working environment for them. And you should also understand that there was just a general lack of trust between the states at this time, right? Many of these states, again, saw themselves almost like different countries. Some of them were 1,000 miles apart. They had huge differences in culture and tradition. So we see this wariness of, and lack of trust between slave states and free states, between small states and big states. And this leads to many different compromises, which I'll talk about in my next video. So before we wrap up here, something to keep in mind as we start to talk about the Constitution, that there were essentially 4 philosophies of government that were leading our founding fathers through the Constitutional Convention, and that we see as common threads here. So you should have these down in your notes. So one, our founding fathers talked a lot about human nature and whether people were born naturally good or naturally evil. And this is a big theme in the Enlightenment as well. And our founding fathers believed that people, for the most part, were born self-interested, that they were selfish. And so as a result of that, we needed a government that would protect itself and protect people, kind of, again, protect them from themselves, right? And that would guard against the selfish nature of most people. We also see that this idea of political conflict, right? Madison believed that the distribution of wealth or property often caused conflict between people, and this would lead to the rise of factions, right? Different groups vying for power, and that there were ways to check the power of factions in a Republican form of government, and he talks about this in Federalist 10. Another kind of guiding philosophy that we see here is that most of our founding fathers believe that people should have the right to achieve wealth, that you should have the freedom to make as much money as you want. So again, this idea of capitalism here. And then finally, most of them believe that because people were self-interested, that there needed to be a way to separate or divide up the power and to keep one branch of government or one person from gaining too much power. And so most of our founding fathers believed in a balanced government or the separation of powers, and James Madison makes an argument for this in Federalist number 51. So now we're set up, in our next video, we're going to talk about the key compromises that were made during the Constitutional Convention, but now you're set up with some context here. So thank you for watching.